Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 61st episode of Weekend Warriors, the review series for the sports cars of Gran Turismo 6 in particular for this pick. And this time we're discussing another Porsche based model. Of course, RUF is the representation of Porsche on Gran Turismo, at least up until Gran Turismo Sport, now that we have actual Porsches on the game. But this particular version is not necessarily what you could call an entry-level model, that's more the 3400S, but it feels more like an entry-level version than something like the CTR2 or the Yellowbird, and the model is the BTR. Personally, I like this probably the most of all of the RUFs that are currently on Gran Turismo. On Gran Turismo 2 there were some other pretty nice ones which haven't been featured since, but of the ones which we have now, I think this is probably my favourite. I like the look that it has, I like the body kit, and I like the fact that although it's not quite as quick as some of the other RUFs, it still certainly isn't slow, especially for its power. Now, speaking of that power, the 3.4 litre, of course, rear-mounted engine in this car can be turbocharged up to 766 horsepower and a very impressive 631 foot-pounds of torque. Now, that alone would be impressive enough. That would make it one of the best cars in this entire series. However, when you combine that power and torque into a total package that weighs not much more than a tonne, in British money, 1,045 kilos, and you've got yourself a monster. And in fact, the horsepower per tonne is one of the highest of, again, this entire series. 733 horsepower per tonne is massive for a road car, for a production car, certainly for a car of its age, and for a vehicle which is essentially more of a high-level sports car, which is definitely bordering on super sports territory. That's impressive. It's very impressive. Now, the BTR is, as you'd assume, already a very quick car. When you tune it, it goes to the next level. If memory serves, I think this car can do somewhere in the region of 265, 270 flat out, remembering back to my top speed tuning days. And as far as acceleration goes, well, it's a Porsche with 760 horsepower, so what do you expect? Now, of course, you don't have the all-wheel drive advantage of something like a CTR2, but the handling can definitely work well if you tune it at the right PP level. If you tune it in the right way, of course, with the suspension, with the diff, and of course with a bit of downforce, that always helps as well. And one of my more popular special projects builds was actually based on this car, a replica of the Le Mans winning Porsche 911 RSR. That tune is only around 540 pp. In fully tuned form, it's nudging up against 600 pp, so that's a much more modest build, and you can feel the difference. When you tune this car up to its absolute peak, the handling becomes, as you'd expect from any car that's working essentially at its limit, a little bit twitchy. And of course, with a Porsche, with a rear engine, rear-wheel drive, older Porsche especially, that's a pretty obvious thing to say. Of course, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Now, funnily enough, I would actually say that in peak tune in particular, this car is actually a little bit more tricky. Maybe that's just me, but a little bit more tricky to drive than the Yellowbird, strangely enough. Because at the end of the day, the Yellowbird was even initially designed to be a faster car. So it's not really too surprising that the Yellowbird can cope better with being peak tuned in effect, whereas with this car you're in effect taking it to a totally different level to what it started at. That's the case with the Yellowbird as well, of course, but not as much as with this car. This is kind of like tuning up a 3400S to be the level of a CTR2. It would be a radically different change in the car's personality, in its handling, in its manners, in its steering. This is a car which does change significantly with tuning. There are quite a number of cars, in fact, that keep their essential identity and their personality regardless of what tuning level you take them to. Something like a Skyline, or an Evo, or an Audi Quattro, or an RS4. They basically stay the same car, but they get much quicker. This one doesn't really necessarily feel the same. The handling characteristics change a lot if you compare the stock level to a mid-tune level to a top-tune level. And it won't necessarily be for everyone. The car is not super affordable. It's certainly one of the more expensive cars. It's not one of the most expensive of this series, but it's a lot more than many of the other sports cars. It costs 112,000 credits, and it has a lot more potential for that money. It's not just an expensive car for the sake of it, it can actually back up that price with racing use. It's fast, it's definitely fun, it's highly competitive, and I know that although that tune which I mentioned earlier, the RSR replica, wasn't really designed primarily with PP specific racing in mind, that some people actually told me that they had used it in racing and it had been very effective. So the car definitely has potential to win events, and not just to win them, but potentially even to dominate them. So although the BTR is definitely not a car which I would recommend for absolute beginners, it is a vehicle which is quite good in stock form in particular for training people with maybe less experience driving tricky cars how to get a hang of it, how to anticipate what a car might do in the corner. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a perfect driver instantly, of course not, but a car like this has enough of a challenge to build your skill, to get it to the kind of lap time which you're happy with, but at the same time it's not as challenging as some other cars, something like a Stratos for instance, or a Shelby Cobra, or some of the TVR models can be a little bit more leery, or even something like a big Lambo like a Diablo for instance. They can be more leery for beginners, whereas with a Porsche it's still relatively compact, it's pretty lightweight, so you feel like even if you do lose control, it's not going to be that bad. Of course, in real life, that's a whole nother story, but on the game, you have that. So overall, although the BTR definitely isn't the strongest RUF overall, it is definitely not a car to be overlooked, and especially in this kind of category of being very high on the sports car spectrum, but not necessarily a full-on super sports car or a supercar. It nestles in that kind of region very well. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.